Well, welcome on to the podcast, Mike. Thank you for being here with us. This is Approachable Sustainability, the Green Business Bureau podcast. And before we get started, do you just want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name's Mike Smith. I'm the CEO at Aclymate. We're carbon management software for small to medium sized businesses. We help our customers figure out what their footprint is, reduce it, offset it if it makes sense, and then report that work to their stakeholders, as well as a certification that they can put up on their website and marketing to show their stakeholders they're doing the work. My background is I used to fly for the U.S. Navy. I spent about 12 and a half years active duty flying F-18s. Had a great career, but had an experience with a wildfire that caused me to reevaluate what I wanted to do. Left the service in order to start my first company called Renew West. Renew West, it was all about post-fire reforestation for climate outcomes. Along the way, developed an expertise in carbon markets and climate policy, was an advisor to the U.S. Climate Alliance. And our big claim to fame at Renew West was the largest carbon reforestation project in U.S. history. We planted 2 million trees in Northern California, finished up on Mother's Day of this year. But along the way, I also developed a real passion for the idea that there was this big chunk of human society that wasn't being given the tools to engage with their own emissions footprint, and that I wanted to help with that. So internal to Renew West, just started a company called Aclymate, recognized it had legs of its own and spun it out about a year ago, and have been doing it ever since. So beyond that, my personal hobbies are mostly involved being a dad, a lot of backpacking and skiing with my kids, who are 7 and 8.5, and a phenomenal wife named Lindsay, who puts up with it all. So that's
well,
me in a nutshell.
That's really fascinating that you used to be in the Navy and then kind of had concerning that you had a kind of scary run-in with a wildfire, but it's really cool to see how you took that and you turned it into action. Not many people do that, so that's really cool to see a case in which you actually did that. And you talked a little bit about how through this process you got some expertise in carbon accounting, and then you talked a little bit about how Aclymate came to be, but can you talk a little bit more about what the vision was and then kind of the evolution into being what it is today?
Yeah. So in my time at Renew West, I remembered that I would go out and I would talk to like smart people in the sustainability space, and I'd have to explain about carbon markets and about climate. And a lot of them felt a little overwhelmed, and it just felt uncomfortable to them, and that they knew that there was something that needed to happen, but they just didn't understand how it all worked. And I got to thinking that if we are creating a system that requires people to have like essentially expertise in carbon markets in order to engage with climate or carbon more broadly, like we haven't built a system that's going to work. And so my co-founder William and I had a big whiteboard session. We sat down, we looked at it all, and saw that there was a really big opportunity to help an underserved segment of the U.S. population, specifically small and medium-sized businesses. When you look at small businesses, which the U.S. Small Business Administration defines as fewer than 500 employees, there are 30 million small businesses in the United States. They employ almost half of the U.S. workforce. They're about 44% of the U.S. GDP. So like small and medium-sized businesses, and fewer than 500 really is more of like a medium-sized business. That was a big opportunity. And so there was a lot of these tools that were out there, well-known competitors of ours that were solving the needs for like the large corporate sustainability departments, those experts in those spaces that needed very specific tools, but there wasn't something for the rest of us, something that would allow, the average person who wants to do something about climate change but doesn't really know how to do it. There wasn't that tool. And so we wanted to build that at Aclymate. We're really proud of what we've built.
Yeah, that sounds great. It sounds like there's a real need in the market. I mean, I know at the very least that you see these big companies and you see, all of their carbon avoidant, carbon reduction tactics, and they have that capital and that ability to really put a big investment into it and work with these larger companies or hire someone specifically. So it sounds like you're helping kind of the smaller guys be able to get the same effect, but without the huge capital that you may need or the huge support that you would need.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at small businesses, there's kind of three neat things that it has there. They have a lack of resources, a lack of time, and they have a lack of knowledge on climate. And so we wanted to make sure that whatever we built, uh, our design standard was this shouldn't take you more than 5 or 10 minutes a month. It shouldn't take any special knowledge about it, other than the only thing you should have to know about climate is that you want to do something about it, and that it should be an affordable price point that every small business would be able to afford. And we've built that.
Cool. So with that being said, you've kind of talked a little bit about different jargon that you relate to in your field. Can you give me a brief overview of carbon accounting and offsets and maybe some other terms that people would need to know to understand the work that you do?
Sure. So one of the first things that kind of scares people off from it is this discussion around scope emissions. And you'll notice actually in our application, we very rarely talk about scope because it's an important distinction for larger climate accounting, but for small businesses, we don't think it's as big a deal. So scope emissions they call them scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 emissions are your emissions, the things that you burned or you directly emitted into the atmosphere. Scope 2 is where you use that energy, but somebody else did the emissions. Typically, this is electricity. And for most small businesses, like that's a big chunk of it. Scope 1 and Scope 2 is where you need to focus your efforts. And then there's this Scope 3, which is kind of all of the above. It includes everything. And Scope 3 emissions can include things like business travel and commuting, but it can also include the embodied carbon associated with your investments or the products that you're buying. And that can get pretty complicated pretty quickly.
Yeah.
When people start talking about scope towards the typical small business owner, their eyes roll back a little bit. Like, we don't need to be doing that. But it is worth noting that the people that your other stakeholders maybe actually care about that. And so we do account for that in the back end. And when we do our reporting, we report the scope emissions, but we don't really expect you to have to learn about what they are. And then within carbon offsets, so a carbon offset falls into roughly two buckets, those associated with avoided emissions and those associated with carbon removals. So an avoided emission is where you pay somebody else to reduce their emissions that they otherwise wouldn't be required to or wouldn't be financially available to do. Some examples of that are like methane off of landfills or avoided methane from abandoned coal mines, where like this methane's leaking into the atmosphere and it's a problem, and nobody's required to do it. And so if it just keeps leaking, then we have problems. And then carbon removals are where you pay somebody to actually pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere or the carbon dioxide equivalent. And so my previous work in Renew West, where we planted all those trees, like that was a carbon removal. We planted a tree, it grew, it absorbed carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. You'll see that there's more modern technologies that are coming out there, like direct air capture and enhanced mineralization and a bunch of stuff out there, where that's starting to happen as well. So that's generally what's happening there. You're paying somebody either to reduce emissions that would already be happening, or you're paying somebody to capture the emissions that have already occurred and pull them back out of the atmosphere. People feel strongly one way or the other. I think that there's arguments for both, and I wouldn't worry too much about it as far as that goes. Broadly, within offsets, there are public registries. You can kind of think of offsets as like the original crypto, where there was like a proof of work and you had like a token that was issued for it. And so in the case of my planting trees, my proof of work was I planted the tree, it grew. You measured the growth of the tree. That was the proof that the work happened and the carbon had been absorbed. And then the token, if you will, that was issued was the carbon offset. And so that's sometimes referred to as a carbon credit. The technical term is a ton of carbon dioxide or its equivalent, TCO2e, but again, more than the small business owner really needs to know about. And so then that token, that credit, can be exchanged back and forth. It is has its own inherent value that goes up and down based upon like the needs of the market. And then at a certain point, somebody decides that they want to retire it. And so they want to consume it as part of their offsetting mechanism. So in Aclymate, you don't see any of the trading, all that stuff that's happening in the background. All you see is a marketplace of different offsets that are available for you to purchase. And the moment you purchase it, it's retired. And so like there's a whole back end of like of market happenings that's going on, and you don't really have to worry about that. You just say, this is what I want. When you buy it, it's retired, and your accounting is updated with that offset.
So it sounds like what you do, Acclimate, is you take what can be complicated and a little seem a little insurmountable for a small business to do on their own. You take it and you present them with the options of what they want to do, but they don't have to worry about all the complicated jargon or all the choices. You kind of deal with that on the back end, as opposed to on the front end, them trying to sift through all of that information on their own.
Yeah, exactly. One other thing that we add in is that the existing solutions before Aclymate were that you would go hire a consultant, and they would talk to you about all the scope emissions and the offsets,
Mm-hmm.
and you'd spend $5,000 to $10,000, a lot of your own time getting that consultant up to speed. They'd give you a report, and then they'd say, "See you next year," and it was up to you to kind of to track and implement it for thereafter, or you would try to teach yourself, and generally you'd get it wrong because the
Yeah.
stuff can get a little complicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, we're very, very proud of the idea of that we can just make this easy. All you have to do is make a series of decisions laid out in plain language about what you want to do, and then off you go.
Yeah, that sounds like you've really simplified that model. Is there anything, I know that you mentioned there's some competitors out there and there's some other choices out there. What's unique about Acclimate model compared to the other alternatives?
We like to say that we're the only purpose-built from the ground up end-to-end small business solution in the United States. A lot of qualifiers in there, which is just to say we have competitors that service large companies. We have competitors that service small companies in other countries. We have competitors that are starting to think about moving into the small business space, but we're the only ones that have been focused from the jump on that problem, and that gives us like a really unique perspective and ability to kind of to help our target demographic, those small businesses, deal with their problems.
Yeah, I can see where maybe if a solution were focused on large businesses to begin with, it would maybe be a little more difficult to scale it down to where it would apply to smaller businesses that don't have all the same resources. But it sounds like you're going more from like a bottom up level as opposed to top down.
Yeah, exactly.
So with that being said, I know that you really focus on small to medium businesses. And why would you say that it's important for all businesses to reduce their emissions and do so through your model?
Sure. So one number that gets thrown out a lot is about like how there's 100 companies that are causing 71% of the world's emissions. And that is both right and wrong. And so back to that scope discussion about that scope 3 is being everybody, all the kind of the included emissions associated with like supply chains. So that scope 1, that those 100 companies and their 71%, like that includes all the downstream uses of their products.
Mm-hmm.
What scope really describes about, though, the scope emissions is actually relationships, which is that the emissions of those large companies are also driven by the decision makers of their employees, their partners, their supply chain, 1,000 different independent decision makers. And all of those decision makers have their own incentives. And so a top-down approach where you create some sort of pressure to say, well, you need to get on top of your supply chain emissions works somewhat, right? But like people are just a much more effective, species in its capacity for organization when you enable independent decision makers to do those things. And so that's where it gets wrong about the 100 companies and the 71%, because for anybody that drives a car that uses fossil fuels, right? You've made that decision. Shell has also made that decision to sell you the gas, but you're the one that's burning it, right? That would actually be as an individual, your scope 1 emission and Shell's scope 3. And so we can kind of point fingers and do this game of like, no, Shell should do it or you should do it. Well, actually, the reality is we all should be doing this. And if we're not all doing it, we're actually probably, tying one hand behind our back as far as being able to deal with climate.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's almost like a double-edged sword where, yes, those big companies, they are responsible and they should be held responsible. I think that that statistic kind of gets at the fact that the responsibility right now is kind of put on the consumer and a little bit taken away from those larger companies. But consumers are also responsible for consuming more responsibly and limiting their own emissions. And it's not just on the people that are giving you the gas, as you described, it's on you to also limit your use of that gas.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is that history of the fact that like BP created like your whole carbon footprint routine, right? And so there's definitely a history there that has to be acknowledged around like emissions accounting associated with that, and that it shouldn't be a passing of buck. There should be an added responsibility, not a replacement of responsibility. So absolutely, the large companies, they have a responsibility that they have to be doing this, and we should give them very few concessions in that insistence upon that responsibility. But the other point is that climate change is really a collective action problem, and how do we change the
Mhm.
behaviors of those large companies is by all acting collectively to change the demand signals. And so I think that's where it's the additional responsibility, not in replace of.
I totally agree with you there. So, with that being said, and talking about kind of the responsibility of people, what would you say your vision for the future is? Either for your company, but then also for the world if people use Acclimate solution.
Yeah, my vision of the future is that everybody knows what their emissions for their individual and for their organizations are, very quickly and at a glance. You can almost kind of think of it like almost like as a credit score,
Hmm.
where you should have a right to know about this. Now, that's not obviously the best analogy because like getting a credit score sometimes is a little bit like pulling teeth. Um, but that this just that this is something that you should know about. Moreover, you have a lot of control over your own footprint. And you should be able to kind of see how that goes. To kind of boil it down into a more simplified version, my wife and I every morning we have a small EV, a Chevy Bolt that we, and then we also have like the kid hauler, the road trip mobile, the Ford Escape, right? And every morning she and I have a conversation about, okay, who's driving more today? What car are you taking? And then that's just a little thing that we build into our life, and part of that is just like is building in climate as part of like what we think about for our as part of our decision matrix. And that's kind of the vision that I have moving forward on this, is that like there's a lot of things that balance into the decisions that you make, and every individual has to kind of weigh those, but like part of that should be climate, and it should be something that's very approachable and that they can use to manage.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I know that one quote that I really like is Greta Thunberg. She said that once you actually become aware of the climate crisis and about climate change, then you can never stop thinking about it. And I think that that's true, like definitely in my own life. The example that you illustrated with your it becomes a regular part, these little switches and these considerations. It's the same thing as I go to the grocery store, I grab my reusable bags. If I just went to the store and I didn't plan for it and I don't have reusable bags, then I just get what I can carry and I just carry it because I don't want to have that extra plastic. And it's these little switches that maybe on the outset may seem a little bit hard to manage and a little difficult, but once you incorporate it into your life, it happens without even thinking about it.
100%. I mean, even as it's fun, as the founder of Aclymate, so I watch employees in my company the longer that they work there. And I tell them about like climate, as part of the onboarding and how these are some of the consequences for it. But I never have told them once about like you should be driving this car versus that car. But it's fun for me, just in this low key way of watching them start to make smarter decisions. Just because, to your point, and just like Ms. Thunberg's point, once you start thinking about climate, you can't stop.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gets a little sticky sometimes, though, because sometimes people make assumptions. And that's the other part of this is that like um, an important part of Acclimate is that we wanted to make this quantitative rather than like a qualitative.
Yeah.
Um, and those assumptions can kind of get you into trouble. So like two examples that we have like of companies that have used our software. One company was really, they wanted to do something about environmental. They had a green team in their company. They were doing a lot of work, and they were really proud of the recycling program they'd put together. And they thought that that was like they were really doing their part for the climate. And when we got them into the accounting, they were like, "Oh, maybe not." Like, like it'd been a lot of effort in order to have relatively. I mean, there's a lot of other kind of co-benefits to recycling, avoided,
Mm-hmm.
but they hadn't really actually made much impact on the climate. Um,
Yeah.
Another company, they were flying people in from all over the world, Argentina, Hong Kong, in order to attend these training events of theirs. And it's like an essential part of their business, like that they do this training in. They're actually in the sustainability field, so they train these people up to go be like local sustainability folks. So they were like, well, there's nothing we can do about climate because we have to fly these people in from all over the place. But then when they got down to their climate accounting, they looked at it and they're like, oh, actually, it turns out that, Bob that drives 40 miles in his F-150s, repeatedly is the bigger issue because he's driving a large truck a certain amount of
Yeah.
distance. And so like all these assumptions that you make in your head of like, no, this is the big thing. And you're like, nope, actually, the big thing's this thing over here. And so
Mm-hmm.
giving people the tools to make it quantitative, like to actually look at it and say, like, no, this is the thing that we need to work on. This is what I have. That's been important to what we do.
I think that's a really great point. I mean, that's a big issue when it comes to climate action is that, like, I know that this isn't specifically with carbon accounting, but you look at the whole plastic straw movement and how now everyone has reusable straws, but is that really making a huge difference in terms of are plastic bags being limited? Are people driving less? Are people using public transportation more? There's these bigger beasts that sometimes people make assumptions about, or like your example with recycling. And I think that that's a really great point that you're taking these assumptions and you're helping businesses that may think, oh, we're doing great because we recycle, or we're doing great because maybe they transitioned an event to virtual or something like that. But you don't see the true picture unless you get it laid out right in front of you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that that's really great. And I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how would you say that Acclimate shows that sustainability is truly approachable?
You know, I would say that part of it's just the business model, right? Make it affordable. You don't require a whole lot of knowledge, and it shouldn't take you very much time. Is part of it, but like part of it is like where we go from here with Aclymate, which is that we're not just stopping at like offsets, and we're not just stopping at carbon accounting. We actually want to be able to like um, help you figure things out on your own. So have our software make some recommendations for you. We want to be able to sell you solutions beyond just offsets. Like offsets, I think, are a very important part of the mix moving forward, but like they're certainly not a replacement for actually reducing your emissions. And so, how can we take the data that you provide us and give you some tailored solutions that make more sense to your company? So, the example I like to give is like perhaps your company owns its own facility, and we can help you to identify a rooftop solar installer to eliminate your
Mm,
scope 2 emissions, and or maybe connect you up with the financing necessary to do that. Maybe you don't own your own facility, and we can connect you up with the community solar garden. Like there's a lot of ways that like we just see this as like, okay, step one is kind of getting this data and helping you to identify where this is, and then step two is actually steering you into solutions that make this just like really easy. So you just look at it and you go, yep, that's the thing that I need. Here's the solution. I can go price shop it elsewhere if I want to. But the idea here is that it'll be kind of a one-stop shop for you.
that sounds great. So, are you saying then that there's an element of almost consulting where you're connecting people with these solutions, or what does that look like?
There's a potential for consulting, I think. There,
Mm-hmm.
software is good at certain things, which is like, repeating, repetitive tasks, automating that. Like that's
Hmm.
what software is really good at. AI is getting better and being able to make certain recommendations, but there's nothing that really totally replaces, a knowledge expert in the field. And so, if people want to have that, a lot of times what those experts would do before Aclymate was is that they would do the accounting themselves, and then they would try to do the report on top of that. But most of the expense
Yeah.
was in doing those highly repetitive tasks around the accounting, right? So if we can automate that, then hand that off to a consultant, if that makes sense, that's I think
Hmm.
is a real pathway for us. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Well, I just have one last question for you. And I know this is kind of more of like a big picture because I know that oftentimes when people work in the sustainability field and you're dealing with things such as the climate crisis and seeing the news every day, it can kind of bring you down. But what would you say that either you've seen or something through your work, what gives you hope with what you do and for the future?
yeah, absolutely. So when I first started in climate was in 2014. That was not only like not the right time to get in the carbon markets, like it was the worst time. People, their trust in carbon markets was not only low, it was getting worse every day.
Hmm.
And so about 2017, it kind of bottomed out and then it started climbing back up. And that has been just like really invigorating. The amount of intelligent people that are that are moving into the space, the amount of capital that's getting connected to it. And that's starting to reflect actually in like some of the scientific projections about like where our future emissions, and what the global warming is. You know, eight, RCP 8.5, like over 4 degrees of warming was still very much on the table when I first started talking about it. They're looking now at 2.2 to 2.7. That's still entirely too warm. That's a lot of
Hmm.
problems, but like things are happening. Like that's really, really exciting. And I think the
Yeah.
thing that drives that the most is a demographic shift. Um, I'm kind of between Gen X and millennials. I kind of align a little bit more with millennials, um,
Hmm.
but the oldest millennials now are in their 40s. Um, Gen Z is even more motivated than millennials on climate. That generation, I like to refer to them as the climate generation.
Yeah.
Uh, 2/3 of them would take a pay cut to work at a climate aligned company. Like that's like a really powerful thing, and that's driving a whole host of behaviors from top to bottom. And Greta Thunberg is like a great example, but like she's one of literally millions of people of that generation that are voting with their pocketbooks and with their feet on what to do. And uh, you know, when I first started in this space, everybody was like, well, this thing is kind of a bubble. It happened the last time, in 2008, 2010, where, well, clean tech is going to be a thing, and then it went away. Nobody's talking about that now. And the reason
Yeah.
is because there's just this absolute groundswell of this climate generation that's going to refuse to let anything like that happen ever again. And I think that's just like, we've got a lot of challenges in front of us, but I'm also like super motivated by those people kind of, committing to that.
Yeah, I that's a great answer, and I feel the same way as you. I'm kind of in between millennial and Gen Z, and my younger sister, her and her classmates, like when she was in high school, they did a March for Science in their high school, and I just think it's really inspiring and empowering to see. And that's honestly your answer is the same thing that gives me hope. It is seeing that they really care and they're walking the walk, and I feel like it's not just going to be allowed to just fall away anymore.
Yeah, 100%. Where there's no going back. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, it is. Well, do you have anything you would like to add or any last words that you'd like to say?
Other than the fact that we're a partner with the Green Business Bureau, and I'm really proud of that partnership. And I thank you for the opportunity to come and speak today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. And to those of you listening, check out Aclymate. They do great work. And as Mike mentioned, they're partners with the Green Business Bureaus. So as part of your Green Business Bureau membership, you would also get access to the Aclymate tool. Well, thank you so much, Mike. Have a good day.
You too. Take care.